All right, strap in, everybody, because today's deep dive is going to take us to, well, a possible future, and it might not be pretty. We're talking about Florida.
Yeah, this is a really fascinating one because the source material we're looking at, it's this article, Manifest Destiny Ventures Florida Experiment, the Corporate Takeover of a State and the Death of Democracy. Kind of a mouthful. It takes a satirical look at some trends that are happening in Florida right now, but it uses a fictional Financial Times article from 2028 to, well, to make its point.
So it's like taking today's Florida and pushing the fast-forward buttons, except it's not all beaches and oranges in this future.
No, not exactly. They're really exploring this idea of the financialization of everyday life in the article. Basically, how corporations are gaining more and more control over, well, everything, housing, education, even the government.
Which is where this whole Manifest Destiny Ventures thing comes in, right?
Exactly. So the article launches us into this satirical Financial Times piece, and it's set in 2028. Florida has been completely acquired by this fictional company, Manifest Destiny Ventures, MDV for short.
Okay, so paint me a picture. It's 2028, MDV's in charge. What's going on?
Well, the CEO of this company, he's standing on a balcony, used to be the Florida State Capitol building, but now it's the Capital Markets building.
Wait, so they just slapped corporate branding on government buildings?
It's satire, right? But it's a way to highlight that shift in power. And it gets even more interesting. They've passed this thing called the People's Choice Representation Act.
Sounds pretty democratic, right?
You'd think so, but it actually restricts voting rights to, get this, white landowning males, and they spin it as a return to, like, originalist intent of the Constitution.
Wow, so a pretty radical rollback of voting rights disguised in this, like, neutral-sounding language.
It is, and it's not just voting. They've even got rid of traditional government functions and replaced them with an AI, a Turnagov, they call it, permits, potholes, you name it, the AI handles it.
Talk about a government run by algorithms. Kind of creepy, isn't it?
Yeah, it makes you think. And then there are these privatized services. Like everything's been corporatized. They've got NOP, the Neighborhood Order and Optimization Program for predictive policing.
So like Minority Report, but in Florida.
Exactly. And public schools, they're gone. They're replaced by these self-directed learning pods. Kids are basically learning job skills through immersive gaming.
So much for a well-rounded education, huh?
It's all about workforce training in this future. And oh, and homeownership, forget it. You're a tenant now, paying MDV a subscription fee for your housing.
Like they're renting their lives from this corporation. And what about, I gotta ask, what about Mar-a-Lago?
Oh, they got plans for that too. They're calling the former president, the eternal president, and they're just waiting. Well, they want to turn it into the emperor's summer estate, part of their portfolio.
They even suggest some new names for the United States, right?
Oh yeah, stuff like United Holdings of America or the Liberty Corporation, even Omni America.
It's like the whole idea of national identity is getting swallowed up by corporate branding.
That's the point the author's trying to make. It's satire, but it's meant to be a wake-up call.
So this satirical Financial Times piece, it's basically a warning, right? Look at what could happen if we let these trends run wild.
Yeah, think of it as a funhouse mirror distorting reality to show us what we might become. But the thing is, some of those distortions, they're not as far from reality as we might think.
Which is where the deeper analysis in this article comes in. Because as crazy as it sounds, a lot of what's in that satirical future, it's based on things that are happening in Florida right now.
Right, and that's where we need to, well, ditch the funhouse mirror and take a look at the reality on the ground. So you remember that line in the article about Florida becoming like a 100% tenancy-based society?
Yeah, everyone renting, nobody owning, right? Seemed a little, I don't know, extreme.
Well, the author makes the case that it's not as sci-fi as it sounds.
Really? I mean, 100% is a pretty big number.
Yeah, it is, but they talk about how private equity firms are basically flooding the Florida housing market.
Okay, so we're not just talking individuals buying a rental property here and there?
Nope, these are firms with billions, with a B, billions of dollars, and they're scooping up everything in site houses, apartment buildings, trailer parks, even those manufactured home communities.
Wow, so they could just like outbid anyone, right?
Pretty much, especially because they're often paying cash, no mortgages or anything. And they're buying in bulk, so that drives prices up for everybody else, makes it even tougher for regular folks to buy.
So it's like a whole separate market almost, one that normal people can't even compete in.
That's what the author's getting at, and it gets even wilder because these firms, they're using all these algorithms, like super sophisticated ones, to figure out how to squeeze the most profit out of these properties.
Hold on, algorithms. Like the ones that tell me what to watch on Netflix. What do those have to do with housing?
Okay, not exactly the same, but similar idea, using data to predict stuff. So in this case, they're crunching numbers to figure out when to raise rents, when tenants are likely to move out, even when to evict people.
Man, that sounds I don't know, kind of cold, doesn't it?
Right. It's like reducing housing to just numbers on a spreadsheet, forgetting about the actual people living there. And that's the big part of what the author's worried about, that housing becomes just another financial asset, all about making money and less about, well, homes for people.
Yeah, and what happens to that whole idea of building equity, owning a home being this path to financial stability? Feels like that's slipping away for a lot of people.
The author talks about that too, how this shift toward everyone being a tenant, it has these ripple effects on everything from wealth inequality to even like political power.
So it all ties back to that satirical article, right? It's not just some made-up company owning Florida. It's these real forces that are changing the housing game, and that's having real consequences for people.
Exactly. And they draw a similar parallel with education. Remember those self-directed learning pods from the article?
The kids learning job skills through video games, yeah, felt kind of dystopian, but also, honestly, not that far off from some of the stuff I see happening in schools already.
Right. Well, the author talks about the whole school choice movement in Florida and all these voucher programs. And they make the case that those policies, they're actually taking money away from public schools and funneling it into private ones, a lot of which are for profit.
So it's like a slow privatization of education.
That's the argument. And the worry is it creates this two-tiered system. You've got these well-funded private schools for the, I don't know, the lucky few, and then public schools struggling to keep up to give everyone else a decent education.
And how does that tie back to those learning pods in the article?
Well, the pods, they represent that fear of what could happen if we keep going down this path, right? Education becoming all about churning out workers, not about, critical thinking, being a good citizen, all that stuff.
Yeah, not exactly inspiring, is it? To think that learning could become more about training for a job than about, I don't know, growing as a person.
And the author's point is this trend in education, plus that corporate takeover of the housing market, it creates this like perfect storm for instability, social and economic instability.
Okay, so now I see how it all fits together. It's not just these separate policies, it's that they all work together to create this system where it seems like a few people benefit and everyone else is, I don't know, kind of screwed.
That's the gist of it, yeah. And this leads to the author's biggest, I guess you could say, their most provocative claim that Florida is like a test case for the whole country.
Whoa, hold on. Florida as a model for the rest of America. I mean, how does what happens with housing and education there translate to, other states?
They call it the Florida as a test case argument. And what they're saying is if these corporate interests, if they succeed in reshaping Florida into this, I don't know, this corporate-run state, other states might follow suit.
So it's like a blueprint for a new America where corporations have even more power than they do now.
That's the fear, yeah. And to really understand why that's so scary, we got to look at what the consequences of this Florida experiment could be. What happens if this actually plays out?
Okay, so let's get into that. What does the author see as the long-term impact of all this? What does this future Florida look like? Who wins and who loses?
They paint a pretty bleak picture, to be honest. They're talking about a Florida with a shrinking middle class, people constantly moving in and out, no sense of community, and all the wealth and power concentrated in the hands of just a few.
Man, that sounds like a recipe for disaster. Is there any hope for a different future, one where Florida doesn't become, ruled by corporate overlords?
Well, the author does propose some solutions, though they're probably going to ruffle some feathers. They're talking about a pretty big shift in how we think about things like housing and education, moving away from this pure market-driven approach and towards something more, well, socialized.
Okay, now we're getting into some big ideas here. What exactly are they suggesting we do? So we've been talking about this Florida experiment, how corporations are gaining more and more control over things like housing, education, even voting rights. It's a little scary to think about, honestly. But the article doesn't just leave us hanging, right? There are some ideas in there for how to, push back against this.
Right, the author isn't just diagnosing the problem, they're offering some potential solutions, some alternatives.
Okay, so what's the cure for this corporate takeover? What do they suggest we do?
Well, their approach comes from, I guess you could say, a socialist perspective. They argue that the real issue is how we've commodified these essential needs, especially housing and education. Turning these things into products to be bought and sold, that's what's creating all these problems.
So they're saying the problem starts with this idea that housing is just another thing you can buy and sell in the market.
Exactly. They believe that housing should be a human right, not something that's exploited for profit.
I can already hear some people saying, whoa, hold on, that's not how things work in America. We have this whole idea of private property, free markets. Housing is a right. That's a pretty radical concept.
It is a shift in thinking for sure, but the author argues that what's really radical, what's really unsustainable is this current system where we have these massive corporations buying up tons of housing, driving up prices and just extracting wealth from tenants.
Okay, so what's the alternative? What do they propose we actually do about this?
They actually call for nationalizing housing, essentially taking it out of the private market and putting it under some form of public control.
Nationalization, huh? That's a big word. Are they talking about the government literally owning all the houses and apartments?
It doesn't have to be that the government directly owns every single property. It's more about shifting control away from the private market and towards models that prioritize, social good over profit.
Okay, so besides nationalization, are there any other ideas they throw out there?
Yeah, they talk about things like tenant cooperatives, where the people who live in a building collectively own and manage it, and public land trusts, which would basically take land out of the speculative market and make sure it's used for affordable housing or other things that benefit the community.
So, a bunch of different options, but all with the goal of making housing more affordable and accessible, not just another way for someone to make a buck.
Right, and the author emphasizes that this isn't just about housing, it's part of a bigger fight against this trend of financialization, corporations taking over every aspect of our lives.
Help me understand that. What other areas are they talking about?
Well, healthcare is a big one. They argue for a single-payer healthcare system, taking the profit motive out of it and making sure everyone has access to quality care. They also talk about things like strengthening labor unions, raising the minimum wage, policies that would redistribute wealth more fairly.
So it's really about rethinking our whole economic system, challenging this idea that everything should be driven by profit.
Exactly. They believe we need a different set of values, moving away from this hyper-individualism and towards a more collective approach where we prioritize the well-being of everyone, not just the people at the top.
It's definitely a bold vision, and honestly, it can feel kind of overwhelming to think about changing these massive systems. So for our listeners who are with us, what's the main takeaway from this deep dive into the Florida experiment?
I think the author's closing statement sums it up pretty well. If we allow corporations to continue financializing housing, will the Florida model spread, turning entire cities and states into corporate-controlled territories? What can we do to ensure a different future?
It's a question that makes you stop and think, about the kind of world we're creating. We okay with corporations having this much power over our lives, treating our basic needs like products they can sell? Or do we want something different, a future where people and communities come first?
And this isn't just about Florida, it's a question we all have to ask ourselves no matter where we live. The choices we make now will determine what kind of world we create for ourselves and for, the generations that come after us.
So to our listeners out there, we leave you with this. What does the Florida experiment mean for you, for your community? What steps, even small ones, can you take to create a different kind of future?
Think about it, talk about it, and most importantly, do something about it. The future isn't set in stone. It's up to us to shape the world we want to live in.
That's it for our deep dive today. Thanks for joining us as we explored this, well, let's be honest, this pretty complex and kind of unsettling topic. We hope you found it thought-provoking, and we encourage you to keep the conversation going.